Good evening and welcome to the University of Bristol. My name is Hugh Brady and I'm the university's Vice Chancellor and President. Before opening this evening's event, many of you watching in Bristol and indeed across the UK will be aware of the tragedy that took place in Avonmouth water treatment facility today, only a matter of miles from the university. While the full details aren't clear, early reports indicate that it was a chemical explosion that resulted in 4 casualties, and our thoughts are with all those affected by these tragic events. Turning to the event tonight, thank you for joining us. It is a very special event, Life Sciences in a Post-Truth World, a COVID-19 case study. The event celebrates the creation of our new Faculty of Life Sciences, which brings together 5 academic schools and some of the world's most distinguished researchers and educators in biological sciences, biochemistry, physiology, pharmacology, and neurosciences, cell and molecular medicine, and psychological science. And how timely. The life sciences have arguably never been more important to our society. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues in the new faculty for the truly inspiring manner in which they have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, they moved their entire curriculum online within weeks. And then during the summer, created a really high quality, research-rich, blended learning for our new and returning students. They pivoted so much of their research to COVID-19, research that has already yielded important new insights into the biology of the virus, how it gains access to cells and causes damage, how the human immune system responds to the virus, and the design and trial of new vaccines. And finally, in line with our civic mission, the faculties, students, and staff have contributed in many ways to our city's response to COVID-19. As you'll hear shortly, faculty members sit on the government's Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, and our valued national and global commentators on both the public health and wider societal impacts of COVID-19. So thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the evening. And now I'll hand over now to our Dean of Life Sciences, Professor Jeremy Tavare.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the formal event tonight of the launch of our new faculty. Before I begin, I've got a few housekeeping notes, as you would always expect in any event. We're delighted to have our BSL interpreters, Harry and Joe, with us this evening. You should be able to see them in the corner. Please note that the event this evening is being recorded and will be shared afterwards via YouTube, so you can watch it again if you like. And finally, you can join the conversation this evening on social media using the hashtag LifeSciTruth and @BristolUni, which you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner of your screens. The Faculty of Life Sciences here at Bristol, as Hugh said, has deliberately brought together a unique combination of expertise which allows us to address a majority of the key challenges that society is facing, both from a research and an educational perspective. From the impact of climate change on living systems within our planet, to mental health disorders, drug addiction, heart disease, and the topic of tonight's panel event, a global pandemic brought about by the virus that causes COVID-19. When we went into lockdown on March the 20th, I had to set about closing our research laboratories and moving all our student teaching online, as Hugh pointed out. At that time, we were already growing the virus that causes COVID-19 in our laboratories, safely, I should point out. We were one of only a tiny number of universities worldwide to be doing so, because 2 of our researchers, Andrew Davidson and David Matthews, had received a sample of the virus very early on from their collaborators in China. As we went into lockdown, I made the immediate decision to only allow COVID-19 relevant research to continue. On that Friday in March, I probably could have counted on the fingers of one hand the number of people actually working on COVID-19 in the university and my faculty. The next day, some of our experts formed what was called the Uncover Group. And within 2 weeks, I'd given permission to over 150 people to come back into work into our laboratories. Most had never worked on a virus before, but they put their hand up as they desperately wanted to turn their expertise towards fighting this terrible disease and working on the virus. They were joined by many colleagues in other parts of the university, including chemistry, population health, engineering, and the vet school, to name but a few, in the most extraordinary display of interdisciplinary collaboration, a trademark approach of the University of Bristol. Tonight is a celebration of all my colleagues who have worked tirelessly for months on end to understand how this virus works and infects people, design and run trials of drugs that are now helping in the fight, including of the Oxford vaccine, develop new vaccines which should not depend on storage in fridges or freezers, and understand how the immune, heart and circulatory systems respond to the virus. I also want to thank all the people that supported the researchers by keeping our labs open, clean and safe. Everybody was essential in this endeavour. While many scientists have been celebrated over generations, more recently they've been met with scepticism by some of our global leaders and by a public discourse where information and opinions of all forms circulate widely in newspapers and on social media. And in some ways, the pandemic has highlighted the role that science plays positively in shaping government policy. But at the same time, with the incredible news about the vaccines and the breakneck speed at which they've been developed and tested, means we're now at a pivotal moment requiring governments and the public to put their trust in these new medicines and the information that's provided about them, their safety and efficacy. Bringing all this together, and with thanks for financial support from the E.H Young Endowment Fund, tonight's event will use COVID-19 as a case study to explore this trust in a so-called post-truth world, or, as Barack Obama put it in his recent interview with David Olusoga, truth decay. I'm going to hand over to Sarah Montague, alumnus of the University of Bristol and recipient of an honorary doctorate, and who will be well known to you as a BBC journalist and presenter of World at One on BBC Radio 4. However, before we go to Sarah, we'll show you a short film that shows how we as a university responded to this pandemic. And don't worry if you missed it the first time, you'll get a second opportunity to see it at the end of the evening. Thank you.
COVID-19.
Scientists here at Bristol University are some of the few who are growing the human coronavirus involved in this outbreak.
You really need to start to dissect the virus on many different levels, dissect our immune response. So the work we're doing here, or some of the work we're doing here, is going to be to start to underpin that.
Colleagues in the School of Chemistry have identified some antiviral agents that may be effective against COVID.
The main aim of our research is to identify drugs that bind to, and therefore block the function of, proteins that are encoded by viral genes.
And we have lots of really amazing researchers here at Bristol looking at the virus, how it causes.
With collaborations with the University of Bristol's Uncover group, as well as Public Health England, we can look at immunity following the virus, as well as secondary infections and respiratory compromise when people are recovering.
It's one of the biggest questions we face right now. How long does COVID-19 stay infectious in the air?
One of the big benefits of being in Bristol is that we have an expert team of virologists who've worked with coronaviruses for many years.
And we are also collaborating with researchers at Oxford University who have given us access to experimental data measuring the coronavirus proteins.
We discovered a new feature of SARS-CoV-2 which was entirely unexpected. It links physiology, the disease and the virus itself.
And the mutations on the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein are the ones responsible for this higher infectivity of the virus.
Everybody is talking about vaccines to defeat the COVID-19 crisis, and we all are hopeful that vaccines will be the solution. So we need to try everything to get the upper hand.
Good evening. I'm Sarah Montague, and Jeremy asked me to chair this because, as he said, my usual job is presenting Radio 4's World at One. But I have to say, over the last 9 months, it hasn't really been World at One, it's been COVID at One. And I've been not only breathing doom and gloom in the nation's ear daily about COVID, but through the interviews, I've experienced, I suppose, firsthand the ebb and flow of public discussion about the pandemic, as indeed we all have, just as listeners to the debate. He also approached me, as he said, because he knew I was at Bristol many moons ago. What he didn't know is that when I arrived as a very green 18-year-old, my first student house was 22 Tyndall Avenue. It has since been razed to the ground to make way for the very swanky building that is now the Life Sciences building. So given that tonight is about launching that faculty, well, how could I refuse? But I was also fascinated by that picture that he painted of so many disciplines coming together because they all found that such was the nature of what we've gone through over the last year. Everyone had something to contribute, which is brings me to the expertise that we have in front of us all tonight. Different disciplines, and I'm going to introduce our panel because we have Paul Nurse, Nobel Prize-winning biologist, Chief Executive of the Francis Crick Institute, and Chancellor of the University of Bristol. We also have the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees. Marvin has been Mayor since 2016. And also we have Professor Lucy Yardley. She's Professor of Health Psychology, member of SAGE, the Government Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Her expertise is in health behaviour change. Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, in the middle of your screen, is Chair in Cognitive Psychology at Bristol. He's an expert in the spread of myths and misinformation in society. On his left, our right, Professor Adam Finn. He's Professor of Paediatrics, Chair of Bristol's COVID-19 Emergency Research Group, and an expert on vaccination. And finally, we are joined by Thangham Debonair, MP for Bristol West, also Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, who's very kindly agreed to join the panel to give us her expertise on the various aspects that we're going to be covering in the next, hour and 15 or so. And the way we've had so many questions come in from everybody. You can feed your own questions in, either via the screen, you'll see how to submit a question, or I'll keep an eye on Twitter under the hashtag LifeSciTruth. But we've got loads, and I'm going to try and feed them through, and we'll try to sort of bounce through a number of topics. But if there's certain questions that you see on your screen that you like the look of, you can promote them up the screen, you can add your own, and I'll try to get to some of them. Before, though, we go to our discussion, I'm going to ask each of the panellists to set the scene for us on this topic, life sciences in a post-truth world. And I'd ask them all to kick us off with some very brief remarks, if you will. Paul Nurse, do you want to kick things off for us?
Sarah, it's very good to be here. I wanted to begin with some rather general comments about the relationship between science, politics and society, because that's really central to this issue of life sciences in a post-truth world. And it's crucial. It's crucial because we live in a technocratic age. We're surrounded by science, surrounded by the technologies that have been driven by science. And therefore we need to have a society that can engage with science, that's comfortable with it. Politicians who can develop policy that can draw on science. And it's my view that successful societies in the future will depend on this, and successful governments just have to work out how to deal best with science. First thing to be said, it's not easy. Science is complex, it's technical, it's difficult to understand, tricky to communicate, often inhabited by rather nerdy people like me. And so it's a tricky subject. I start with the problem, which is embarrassing for somebody who's been a scientist for 50 years, in what exactly is science? If you look it up in a dictionary, you come up with things like organized knowledge of the natural world, built on reliable observation, experiment, advancing through critique and skepticism, eliminating unsatisfactory explanations and understanding. But I say all of these things because there's a particular topic that's important for tonight, often not appreciated, which is science evolves. That means ideas and explanations are challenged. They are changed as evidence and testing takes place. And often in an event like a pandemic that we're suffering now, scientific knowledge is very limited. And what that means is that our knowledge is often tentative. And truth, which is what we're trying to pursue, takes time to emerge. That's why phrases like "we're following the science" isn't very useful, because it's tentative and uncertain. At school, we're learned as if science chiseled in granite, but that isn't actually the case. So politicians and society have to master these situations of complexity and uncertainty. Governments have to think about how to communicate it. They have to rip up their normal PR advice, go deeper and be more nuanced. And none of this is made easy in a post-truth world when often those who shout loudest get listened to. So that's the background, I think, that we need to take account of the discussion we're going to have tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. We're going to come back to you on that. It certainly seemed a lot more mild-mannered than your Daily Mail article the other day, but we'll come to that a little bit later. Marvin Rees, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first off, I just have a little bit of an issue with the idea that there's something unique about being in a post-truth world. There are many people who've lived on the underbelly of this world, who lived in political systems that said they were about freedom and inequality. And life sciences have been a part of that too. Some of the scientific basis for suggesting racial hierarchy, racial supremacy. So we do have to kind of recognize a little bit of that. But having said that, there is something going on at the moment, as you talk about Barack Obama's reference to truth decay, that I recognize that it felt as though there was some pursuit of truth out there. There was something that we could pursue that would ultimately expose these hypocrisies and these contradictions in the way our world was put together. And it feels as though that's fallen away. And this tenuous, this problem we face now is obviously playing itself out, not just in our perception, our understanding of political, social events, but in many aspects, in the very nature of reality, with climate change denial and the denial of COVID at all. There are a few reflections for me coming off the back of that. Politics, some picks up on what Professor Nurse is just saying. One is, in politics and wider debate, it feels, as I sit in the middle of it as a first-time elected politician, that this is not the political debate is not a contest, a pursuit of truth. It's a contest for controlling perceptions of what's going on. The truth is distant. These are short-term, one-dimensional arguments that take more than 10 minutes to explain, but there's just no space to do that in the public forum. And the danger is, and actually I would say that this is the result of a problematic dance between politics, journalism and social media as well, so we're all part of this. The second point I would just share, and I know there are problems with many things I'm going to say now, they're just my perceptions. But we have farmed cynicism over the last decades. The easy dismissal of politics and politicians as all lying, the way we do our way we facilitate public debate as a big conflict, that is now coming back to hit us. Most people don't undertake their own research. Most people don't know politics. They live research and they live politics through the work of other people, through media. And they rely on the research undertaken by scientists. Once we lose trust in our public institutions, then the ability to trust their research and perceptions is obviously undermined. And that's one of the challenges that we are harvesting today. My final point would just be on some of the consequences of this. And I think it is a real threat to democracy, as we've seen in the United States. We talk a lot about accountability today. But I think too often people are talking about accountability to them. Ultimately, this is about accountability to truth. But to hold people accountable to truth, you have to have access to truth. And because that relationship is so weak at the moment, I think it's a subtle and invisible, but a very deep, real threat to our very democratic institutions.
Paul, thank you very much. Lucy Yardley.
Thank you very much. I was catapulted by the pandemic into trying to provide science advice to inform policy, which I really hadn't done very much of before, and just wanted to share some of the challenges and dilemmas that we faced. So just to take you back to the beginning of the pandemic, what was the science? There was practically nothing. As a behavioural scientist, I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and looked at the media for accounts and photographs of what was happening in other countries and tried to guess how that might influence what would happen here. We looked to past research, but how relevant is that? Past pandemics and other infections in different contexts are actually really, really different, just as other countries are very different to this one. So the question is, can what you learned in the past or in other countries actually transpose to here and now in the UK? So we also had surveys that were going out, focus groups and various forms of self-reports, but you relied on people answering them, and it's actually a minority who are probably not typical that answer, and you could really only guess whether people were being completely genuine in their responses. So all of this was feeding into the committee, and we would try to come to an expert consensus with all of these sources of very imperfect data. Now, I don't want to be too depressing about the situation. Occasionally, we had a little bit longer to work, so the paper that I enjoyed putting together most was actually on housing and the problems of transmission within the home, because that was actually my expert topic. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I'd been able to roll out our germ defense intervention, which had been shown to reduce transmission of infection in the home. And we were collecting lots of data through that about what things people were prepared to do in the home, what barriers they were facing and so on. So we did actually have our own pipeline of real live data coming from tens, well now hundreds of thousands of users. And we also, because we knew we had 3 weeks to write that paper, which is an unprecedented long time, and we were able to go out and do a really rapid study in Bristol with members of various ethnic minority communities to find out what challenges they faced in their homes and what might help them overcome the challenges to keeping other household members safe. But you can see that often we only had a day to turn around advice. You can see how challenging that was. If I go on to the next slide, then the question is, you have your evidence, it goes to SAGE, then it goes through Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, who everybody knows by now, who sit on COBRA and advise the government. Then there's a whole lot of voices in government. And then, you know, the simple pipeline is it then going out to the public. However, it very soon became clear that in a post-truth recursive society, there are multiple channels, which of course is a good thing, because if it was simply that one pipeline and the scientists' advice was not perfect, which of course it never was, then that would be very dangerous. But actually what you got was other scientists making their news available both to the government and directly to the public and the media, of course, getting involved, this all feeding back into the policymakers. So it's a very complex picture with lots of voices in it, and it's absolutely the right thing, of course, that there should be lots of voices around in science, but it does make it difficult for the public to know which voice to trust, and I think has had a role in increasing levels of uncertainty at times. I think that's all I wanted to say at this point.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Stephan, Professor Stephan Lewandowsky. Stephan, I don't know if I can't hear you. I think you might be muted. Let's get on top of the technology.
Thank you. I thought I would be unmuted. Well, my remarks connect to both the preceding speakers, because my expertise is in misinformation and propaganda and fake news. And like as the mayor said, I share the concern that we're living in a post-truth world in which accountability has become extremely difficult. And in fact, the age of COVID has been accompanied by what some people have called an infodemic. If you just advance the slide, you should see that come up. And in terms of data on that, there are concerning survey results from the United Kingdom that, you know, perhaps up to 25% of the people are believing in some sort of conspiracy theory relating to COVID-19. And we have seen the adverse consequences of that earlier in the year when cell phone towers were blown up or set on fire in the United Kingdom because of a conspiracy theory that related 5G to COVID. So we do have a problem there, and we have to talk more about that maybe later tonight, how to deal with that. However, it's not all bad, and I think that is something that's important to remember. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that the infodemic, as much as I'm concerned about it, has also been accompanied by some data suggesting that people's trust in scientists and experts generally in the United Kingdom and other countries has increased. So specifically, earlier this year, in one survey, about 2/3 of the British public was saying that because of COVID, their trust and reliance on experts and scientists has increased. It became apparent to the public that you cannot solve a real crisis with populist slogans or sound bites or appeals to wishful thinking. And frankly, if you look at the United States now and how they have done managing the pandemic, you can see how devastating the consequences can be of reliance on effectively populist slogans and wishful thinking. And that increased reliance on science and experts is also relatively widespread. We have data from Germany and other European countries, even the United States, where the majority of people has become more accepting of scientists. And one of the very interesting things is that if you ask people in some of these surveys, well, you know, how do you deal with disagreement between scientists? It turns out that in a German survey, at least, the people were saying, we actually appreciate controversy between scientists because what it tells us is that they're having a vigorous debate, which allows us to come up with the truth at the end. And I think I want to finish on that encouraging note, not forgetting about the serious problems that we also have with conspiracy theories and the infodemic.
Stephan, and we'll come back to that anyway. Adam Finn, Professor Adam Finn.
Good evening. Yes, my name's Adam Finn. I'm a paediatrician, a vaccine trialist, and an optimist. And at Adam H. Finn's my Twitter handle. I tweet about vaccines. So if you're interested in vaccines, do please consider following me. Next slide, please. So when people engage with a vaccine, either for themselves or their children, they are in fact making a risk-benefit judgment. They're judging whether the benefit of the vaccine in preventing an illness they don't want to have is more important to them than a potential risk of some possible side effect. And in reality, for vaccines, that choice is very obvious nearly all the time because they are safe and effective. There is a problem with vaccines that they're sometimes the victim of their own success, that the diseases they prevent disappear and people forget and are unaware of the risks that they're taking by not having vaccines. Next slide, please. In fact, these decisions are driven by fear of the illness that you might get and potentially fear of the vaccine if people have stoked up concerns in people's minds. And fear is a very powerful emotion and it can lead to irrational decision making. Next slide, please. But in reality, as Marvin told us earlier, most people make their decisions by looking sideways. Some of you will recognize this scene from the film When Harry Met Sally. And Meg Ryan, who's acting Sally, has just faked an orgasm, and the lady next door is looking at her sideways and says to the waitress, "I'll have what she's having." That's how a lot of us make our decisions all the time. When we decide which phone to buy, which gym to attend, which drink to have in the pub, we actually make the decision by proxy. We don't do our own research. We look around us and see what other people are doing and follow suit. And so the information that we get about what other people are doing is critical in driving our decisions around vaccines as well. Next slide, please. So the final point I'd like to make is that we are in the UK at least, very much the beneficiaries of trust. We have a National Health Service that the vast majority of the population cherish, they value it very strongly, and they trust it. And we deliver vaccines through our National Health Service, and implicitly people trust the National Health Service to give them safe and effective vaccines that are free at the point of delivery. And actually, the majorities that we command in vaccine programs are majorities that politicians, colleagues on this panel, could only dream of. More than 95% of parents have their children immunized with routine vaccines. So we are in a very positive place. There are dangers for misinformation if it's handled badly, but we are in a very strong place to be able to deliver vaccines. And I think these new vaccines will be no exception. Thank you.
Madam, thank you very much. And finally, Thangam Debonair.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the University of Bristol. And I've had the honour of being the Member of Parliament for Bristol University for 5 years and had early conversations with the Policy Studies Unit about how we could work effectively together. And this resulted in a series of events where a range of scientists gave micro lectures for me, I felt very privileged, but also a range of other policymakers to give us clear, accessible information about topics that we could influence in politics without any dumbing down, but followed by a discussion about how we would translate that knowledge into change. And there's also, my experience has been very positive about the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, also called POST, a brilliant institution whose board I've been a member of, and which allows parliamentarians and scientists together across disciplines to identify topics to provide scientific brief to members of Parliament on, to commission and publish those briefings, hold events, provide academic placements and research fellowships, and all their briefings are freely available for all. Now, although both of these are a great way of increasing the voice of scientists and the engagement with politicians, my favourite has got to be, of course, as an MP, the lab coat visit. Here you see, I hope, the product of a demonstration of a 3D printer. This is how I learnt about 3D printing. It's a miniature version of the cello you see behind me, and in the words of Father Ted, this one's small, that one's far away. But I will never forget that visit, and nor the one in which I received a tuber from one of the life science virologists in Bristol University. So visual aids really help us politicians. This event, I think has reminded me how quickly something can balloon into fake news. This summer, we in Parliament passed what's called a statutory instrument, a very dry legal tool, ensuring that it would be legal for the MHRA to licence any vaccine before the end of the Brexit transition year. And this sort of legislation normally attracts no attention whatsoever, but I was heavily lobbied about it being a bypassing of safety and a bypassing of research, and people appeared to be sharing information about this on social media. Somebody clearly had their eyes on our order paper. And I've also heard from people who call themselves vaccine skeptics rather than anti-vaxxers. They send me heavily referenced essays with links to what look like scientific articles. They often misinterpret conclusions which other scientists have written in a rightly cautious manner. And you can see how they might then get to a point of certainty of their own analysis. Now, my experience as an MP has not been that rebuttal, just outright myth-busting, doesn't really work with these. It just results in a ratcheting up the disagreement. And I think if we take vaccination stories as an example, I think the better focus is on the benefits, the spirit and the emotion behind collective effort that we've all been engaged in this year. I wear my mask to protect you. You stay off public transport when you have symptoms to protect me. And we all vaccinate because we all want everyone to be free of these restrictions. My experience, finally, of the last 9 months has been of the power of a visual story. So as well as showing you my little cello, I'd also like to remind us all of the visual story of driving to Barnard Castle to get your eyes tested. This did more to undermine public confidence in government messaging and in turn scientific advice than I think anything else this year. Certainly that's what overwhelmed my inbox. And I think we need to recognise in turn the value of the picture and the story as a force for good, as the ways most people make sense of their worlds and their place in it.
Thangam, thank you very much. Now, listen, I've got some questions coming in. Thank you very much. Do keep them coming. A lot, as on previously, are on vaccines, which we'll get to shortly. But I would like to start with the political handling of the past year, because it's where you started, Sir Paul. And it's also what you wrote about in the Daily Mail the other day, and which I referenced after you spoke, because your words then, or at least certainly the headline, which seemed to sum it up, with regard to the vaccine, the heroic efforts tragically undermined by our failing political class. And there were quite a few questions that came in along these lines. One here, the Westminster government's cavalier approach to implementing sage advice has undermined public trust in science. Paul Nurse, do you think the government was cavalier, or did it largely follow the science?
Well, firstly, let me just say, as I'm sure you know, Sarah, you never write the headlines on these things, and I never say anything quite as unsubtle as that headline. However, to address the question, I actually think our politicians, our political leaders, were mostly doing their best. But it wasn't good enough because it's a very complicated situation that we had to deal with. I think they were genuinely trying to follow the science, but the science was uncertain, as I said in my introduction, and they didn't get to the bottom of that quickly enough to realize that their statements had to be nuanced, it had to reflect what reality was, and it couldn't be so, how can I say, constantly, we are the best in the world and we're about to have a breakthrough and we're about to have an app that's going to work and we're going to have a vaccine by September and we're going to have 100,000 tests, except 40,000 of them are in the post. And you have mentioned, or it was mentioned by another panelist, about how the trip to have your eyes tested destroyed trust. But all of these things destroy trust as well, because it's linked with the science, it's connected to the science, and we have to be just very careful about how we're dealing with it. So I think the politicians were trying, but they didn't quite get the messaging right. And then they got more and more sort of panicky in a way. And I think they were probably following advice from scientists quite often. But that's a bit shadowy, and I just wanted to say something about that. We hear a lot about SAGE, and that's now quite open. It wasn't quite as open as it should have been at the beginning. But that generates some knowledge. But to translate that knowledge into policy and the delivery of policy requires the politicians and requires scientists as well, who we don't hear about. They're somewhere deep in the Department of Health or somewhere, and they are generating policies that actually are critical for what we do, policies that led to large, rather isolated laboratories, policies about who we should be testing. Yet we're not challenging that. We're not seeing that out in the open. And I think we've got to get the policy delivery and also the communication of that delivery much more transparent and open than has been the case.
Professor Lewandowsky, I wonder what your thoughts are on this, because in some ways, we've all listened to one scientist argue completely contradicting the previous scientist, both experts in their field. If we're assuming this to happen is what's happening also with behind the scenes in government, is it any wonder that that perhaps they're persuading the government one way or another, but then it comes out as it does through the politicians?
First of all, I want to echo what Paul was saying about the importance of having a consistent message. And what happened, in my opinion, in the United Kingdom was that early on, once the lockdown was underway, the stay home, stay safe, and save the NHS or whatever it was, that was a very effective and good message that I think people listened to, and that worked out relatively well. Now, as far as the scientific debate is concerned, the evidence on that is sort of twofold. On the one hand, people are able to understand that certain scientific findings come with an uncertainty range. And in fact, there is evidence to suggest that, for example, climate projections, if they're presented with error bars, that is enhancing the public's willingness to accept that because the scientists are being honest about the limits and degrees of their knowledge. Now, on the other hand, however, it is also the case that when there is a scientific consensus, as in climate change, then a dissent from that is politically motivated and that is trying to undermine that scientific consensus is very damaging. We also have data on that. And so I think what's happened with COVID is a little bit of a mix of those two things, because unlike climate change, there was a lot of uncertainty in the science itself early on. I'm not a virologist, but I was following the literature as best I could, just out of my own interest, and it was very clear that there were lots of uncertainties. But what's also happened, unfortunately, is that there were some actors in public space who were trying to undermine relatively well-established science for political reasons and in pursuit of an agenda. And funnily enough, it was actually the same people, the same think tanks that were producing climate denialist material that are now also producing so-called lockdown skeptical information or information against social distancing, which is, you know, scientifically not tenable. So it's a very complicated blend of, on the one hand, justifiable uncertainty that the public can deal with, but on the other hand also disinformation that has served to confuse the public.
Marvin Rees, I wonder if you could if you're in a position to defend politicians, because of course scientists need to be focused on only one thing. Politicians need to be focused on so many more things. And when you think back, certainly to the beginning, when so little was known, did you have some sympathy for the various positions that were taken there?
Well, I wouldn't classify that as defending politicians. I don't defend politicians. They're not one breed of people. If I can just go back, think about what we just talked about there. You read out a headline that robbed the argument of any nuance. And this is the point I made at the beginning. You know, politicians operate on a field of play. And if we want to have sophisticated arguments in which we say, do you know what? I'm about 75% sure. There's no graciousness.
I'm going to interrupt you here just for a moment, and I promise I'll come back to you. But I read the headline, but I could have read the detail, which says their failure has been one of policy delivery and communication, not science. But every one of their broken promises subtly feeds into a public skepticism of science and expertise. So just to be fair, but please do go ahead.
All right, be fair, that's fine. But I'm just saying this does happen time and time again when we've got quite sophisticated challenges that we face. And it's condensed down into no more than a tweet, and that's what people read. And I'm just saying that there is a difficulty of having nuanced conversation in the public square, because most people don't interact with politics and politicians. They interact with the public interpretation of politics through a media that sometimes goes for hits in competition because of their business model. I'm not ragging on. I'm just saying we're all a part of this undermining of the quality of public debate and pursuit of truth. But yeah, I mean, there are many things to think about. I mean, as I come from a public health background, from the beginning we were saying, yes, the virus is a threat to health, but so is inequality, so is poverty, so is joblessness and that loss of hope. We know that through the life course, the impacts of the consequences we take to counter the virus, which must be taken, will also have both medium and long-term health consequences for the country. But I don't think that's a contest with scientists. You know, it doesn't necessarily need to be a battle. There'll be plenty of scientists who will recognise that as a truth that has to be taken into account as well.
Okay. Marvin, while I'm speaking to you, you clearly irritated, well, it sounded almost as if you're a bit irritated, understandably, by the use of the word post-truth. Because for some, as you made the point, for some communities, it's always been post-truth, which I thought was a fascinating suggestion. Does it irritate you? I can't hear. Marvin, are you muted? Sorry.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
I wouldn't call it irritation, but let's go back to a classic. We've been talking about Frederick Douglass recently. It's been a Frederick Douglass gave his famous speech, "What's the 4th of July to me?" You're celebrating a day of freedom in the middle of slavery. You know, there are many people who have lived on aspects of society that have said, where that society has said things about itself that are just clearly not true. Now, to people in the upper echelons of that society, it may feel that they live free and truth, but there are many people on the underbelly who would not live in that reality and say, actually, this is just blatantly not real. So it's not an irritation. To me, it's the blind and the obvious.
Professor Yardley, you want to come in? And then Professor Lewandowsky.
The complexity. Sorry?
We can hear you now, go for it.
Okay. I was thinking about the complexities of communication to the public. And it's absolutely true what Stephan said, that the very simple message that we started with went down well and people understood it and felt they were all part of it, the stay home to save lives. The problem was that once we started trying to resume activity carefully and safely, a simple message like that wouldn't work. The only way that we could learn how to do that was to everybody engage with really quite complex infection control and trying out different methods and finding out which activities were going to lead to the infection getting out of control and how much we could resume safely and which activities. And that was such a complex process that it needed a much more nuanced kind of interaction and dialogue with the general public that I don't think we have achieved. And some other countries probably have been able to do better, but again, you know, their contexts are very different. So, you know, somewhere like Sweden, that kind of dialogue is more common with the public.
Stephan, I'm not coming to you just yet, but Thangham, can I have your thoughts on that? The idea that we might be a society where we could talk about complex issues. We're having a problem. I think you're muted, Thangham.
I was asked not to touch my mute button. I genuinely was asked not to touch it. So, and I'm allergic to hearing the words "you're on mute." So I'm going to stick to unmuting myself. I think I want to chuck in a little firework here with Paul, because I think that there's a danger here of lumping all politicians in together. The government is not all politicians. The government had access to scientific advice, which the rest of us did not, and we were challenging them on it. And there were also, I think, there was the problem with the fact that, as I think any scientist would acknowledge, that the scientific knowledge was emerging, and yet scientists were on either side of the Prime Minister, night after night, or Michael Gove, whoever, when they said, we're just following the science. And nobody said, actually, that doesn't make sense. Now, I was quite irritated, actually, by the fact that Michael Gove in particular, who had decried experts 4 years ago during the referendum, was suddenly hiding behind what he was making out was scientific expertise for a series of decisions without really any transparency. So I find that problematic because I think even if there was a point in the pandemic where my epidemiologist brother-in-law was telling me things as if they were facts and they were related to flying, I think, at that time. And I Googled, what do epidemiologists think about flying? And there was a lovely article in the New York Times saying 511 epidemiologists were all asked when they're going to fly again, when they're going to hug again, and they didn't agree. So I think as politicians, we work with what we've got. I think as government, they have access to scientific evidence that we as the opposition politicians and others do not, and we have to make the best of it. And I don't really feel that this year has been an exalting year in some ways for giving us access to better quality knowledge. I think it's been a year in which many people have felt so frightened, really frightened of what was going to happen, that they've turned to whatever gave them comfort. And as Lucy said, in the early days, that comfort came from the certainty of straightforward rules.
Can I ask, do any of the scientists here think that it was a mistake of the government scientists to stand alongside them at the press conferences?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I'm not sure the word mistake is quite right. I think when things were said that weren't correct, and I think when we saw the defence of the eye testing car drive, then they should have said something, even when flanking the Prime Minister. And they did not, and they should have done, in my opinion. I don't think it's a mistake that scientists are seen there, but they do have a responsibility to tell it how they see it. And just to be clear, my view, and what I tried to express in the article you've referred to, Sarah, is that we have had problems, not just with politicians, but with the scientists too. And what we need now, I think, is a more mature relationship between scientists dealing with the complex issues and politicians having to wrestle with the same issues. And that there have been difficulties on both sides. And it's not a mistake that the scientists were there. It was a mistake that they didn't speak up.
I'm conscious of the time, so I want to move on to the subject on which really, obviously, we've had probably the most questions, which is that of vaccines. And Stephan, you said earlier, I had no idea that the research that you were talking about, 25% believe in a conspiracy theory relating to COVID-19. I presumed you were going to say we're hesitant about taking a vaccine, but what does the research show about vaccine hesitancy and the stronger sort of anti-vax movement?
Right. Yes. Well, can you hear me? I'm not supposed to unmute myself. So, okay, great. Well, the numbers are similar to what I mentioned earlier. I think it is safe to say, on the basis of a number of different studies I've seen, that about 2/3 of the public in the UK, but also in other European countries, are either very willing or certainly entertaining a COVID vaccine for themselves. I mean, they're looking forward to it and they want this because it's, our ticket to freedom. And then there are some people that are undecided, and then you have a smallish but nonetheless significant number, somewhere between 10 and 25%, who are resistant to vaccinations, or at least they indicate that they are. Now, what are we going to do about that? What's the best way forward? Well, it turns out that if you look at the literature on vaccinations, and there's a lot of literature on the behavioral science of vaccine uptake, one of the things that is really important is to make a vaccine easily available, cheap, free, uncomplicated. The moment you put up an obstacle, uptake drops. It is as simple as that. People are creatures of habit, they're creatures of convenience, and if something is easy to do, then it will be done. Even simple things like disinfecting your hands. If there is a if there is a pump, then you'll find that people will disinfect their hands a lot more than if there's a bottle you got to unscrew and turn upside down. It takes seconds, but nonetheless, convenience matters a great deal. And what also matters in the context of vaccines is to paint a positive picture of how safe they are, how thoroughly tested they are, and how much they allow us to go back to normal, and to emphasize also the common good, because every time somebody gets vaccinated, they're not just protecting themselves, they're also contributing to everybody else staying healthy. So in a nutshell, those are the major angles of attack.
Adam, can I ask you about that? What do you think will be and it's a question that was submitted from the audience, what do you consider to be the likely impact on the rest of society by those who refuse to have the vaccine? How important is it that whatever campaign erodes the hesitancy and the scepticism?
Well, what I said at the beginning holds here. I'm actually an optimist about this. I think in the first instance, the problem we're faced with is that demand is going to vastly exceed supply. And the people who are going to be being offered the vaccine are people who are at very high risk and are very anxious to try and reduce that risk. So with regard to the risk-benefit balance that I showed in that slide, it's enormously in favor of receiving it. Colleagues that I work with in the hospitals constantly asking me about how soon they can get vaccinated. So in the first instance, there's not going to be a problem. I think other people that Steve mentioned who are more cautious, understandably so, because these vaccines are new and relatively untested at this point, that opinion will change because we'll have much, much more experience of their use in the very near future as very large numbers of people start to receive them. And ultimately, with a vaccine of this high efficacy that we're hearing about, it would be very surprising if they did not have an impact on viral transmission as well, and therefore induce the kind of herd immunity effect that Steve alluded to. I think that's not certain at this point, but it's extremely likely. And with an infection, with the degree of infectiousness that this one has, we don't need 100% coverage if there is a reasonable impact on transmission. We would expect 60, 70, 75% transmission coverage, to achieve bringing down the R rate to a point that the epidemic ends. So I'm not sure that I'm too worried about these surveys. I think, as was said, we've got an NHS that people trust. We have a system that makes vaccines very easily accessible to people. And I think things are going to go well.
It's going to come up. The first people to get this vaccine are going to be elderly. Now, there's going to be people who will die. They would have died anyway. Is there a danger that just the nature of it will affect the public conversation when people die just after they've had a vaccine?
Yeah, that's a very real risk. And in fact, we do need to be careful that that kind of narrative doesn't get hold. I mean, we have to understand that bad things happen all the time. And if you've happened just to have had a vaccine, that doesn't mean the vaccine was responsible for that. Clearly, if we give the vaccine to very old and frail and infirm people, a number of them are going to die as they would have died just as with or without the vaccine. So that kind of narrative is important. And the dialogue we've been hearing from a number of colleagues on this panel, that we do need to communicate actively and clearly with everyone about this from now moving forwards is really important. And we can't just expect it to happen without good communication.
Professor Yardley, you want to come in on that?
Yes, because we actually did some research in the last pandemic on swine flu that is very relevant to this. During the swine flu, there was a scandal in the papers about how some children who were given, I think it was the vaccine rather than the antivirals, developed narcolepsy, which is obviously very unfortunate and did happen. And at the time, that did lead to a lot of anti-vaccine sentiment, as you'd expect. However, we did some follow-up focus group and survey work, and we discovered that if you told people the relative risk to their child of getting narcolepsy from the vaccine compared with the risk of actually dying if they didn't have the vaccine, then people completely took that on board, because actually the risks of dying were much worse than the risks of narcolepsy. So that's a very good example of how if you provide honest, balanced information to people, then they really can take that on board, and it helped convince people.
Stephan, I think this is quite a few for you, because there's so many questions that have come in along these lines. How do we talk to people who believe in conspiracy theories? They see us as part of the problem. How do you talk to people who spread misinformation, incorrect facts regarding COVID possible treatments? How to deal with COVID deniers, anti-vaxxers, without sounding terribly condescending or patronising? What's the answer to that?
Great question. How much time do you have? This is a semester's worth of lectures right there. No, but seriously, first of all, I think when you're communicating, you got to work out who your audience is and who you want to spend your time with. There's only a finite amount of time in the day for me or anybody else to talk. Who should we talk to? Well, my answer to that is we should talk to the public at large and the people who are actually willing to listen to evidence, who are susceptible to facts, who think that they are valuable, and explain to them precisely as Lucy was saying, what are the risk trade-offs, what are the costs and benefits of this vaccine. And what I'm doing here when I say that is I'm practicing a little bit of social isolation or social distancing, let's put it that way, vis-a-vis conspiracy theorists and so on, because they are not a particularly rewarding target for communication. What I think is far more important, and a lot of research is showing that, is to inoculate the public against being misled by conspiracy theories or by people who reject vaccinations, and to do so by explaining how it is that those people mislead. So let me give you one example of how that might work. One of the interesting aspects of conspiracy theories is that they're incoherent. Most conspiracies are incoherent, internally contradictory, and incoherence is a marker of being wrong. You know, you talk to a philosopher of science or a scientist, if you're incoherent, you're wrong. So let me give you one example of how a conspiracy theory about COVID can be wrong by being incoherent. And in fact, I picked this up on YouTube. Within 30 seconds, the same person said, oh, COVID is a hoax. Doesn't exist. It's a hoax. 10 seconds later, the same person said, oh, COVID is a virus that was developed as a biological weapon in a laboratory in China. Well, hang on. What is it? Is it a hoax, in which case it doesn't exist? Or does it exist? It's not a hoax and it's a biological weapon. Well, it can't be both. And yet there are people out there who are, you know, sort of contradicting themselves within seconds. Now, that's a very good marker, and that is something that we have shown in laboratory experiments. We can teach the public to recognize incoherence in a 2-minute video, and once they know that, they can dismiss that kind of information. So my approach would be to talk to the public at large about how they might be misled.
Right. The person who was doing, rather, you're talking about inoculating, but the person who was actually doing it, just briefly, do you just give up on them? The guy who's posting contradictory lines.
Well, I mean, I think that depends on the individual instance. If you look at the number of people who are communicating a conspiratorial narrative, for example, on Reddit or whatever, you find that there's a whole spectrum of belief in that community. And there are some people who are quite susceptible to corrections, even though they may articulate a conspiratorial narrative. And then there are others who are not. And it's extremely difficult for me, without actually, being confronted with a person, to identify which of these we're talking about. But generally, I think we should aim our communication at the public at large and give them the skills so that they can decide whom they should trust based on these rhetorical markers of disinformation.
I grew up in Bristol, and I see amongst some of the groups on social media, amongst people I grew up with, some of these theories, conspiracies floating around. It's been a little pushback I've shared with a few people. You need to read more books and less Facebooks. But I think people's willingness, ability to believe an argument, and I'm not necessarily research this, but it would seem to me we depend on a few things. Amongst them, the quality of the argument made, but also who's making the argument. Even a well argument made from someone who's not trusted, or from an institution that has lost credibility with a group of people, people will say, well, you can beat me in an argument, but I know someone who can beat you in an argument. They're just not with me right now. And there's that sense in which it's no matter what you say or what coherent the argument or the tools you give people, they just won't be accepted. I think that feeds into another issue, which is a broader political issue, which is about that history of trust and non-trust between institutions and the public, but also questions of representation. And are the institutions from which we are supposed to source our truth, are the institutions whom we are supposed to trust for that truth representative of us? Do they come from our people, as it were. And by that, I don't just mean racially or ethnically. I mean issues of class. Have those institutions looked out for me? Do they have a track record? And so that wider issue of how we build a stronger democracy, more social political inclusion, I think has consequences for our ability to get at truth. And ultimately, if we don't do it, we end up paying a price for it.
Okay. We know that the vaccine is not going to be compulsory, but it may become a condition of entry in so many places that effectively we have immunity passports. Paul Nurse, do you think it would be a mistake if that is the direction of travel of society?
Well, I think it depends on the magnitude of the problem, probably. I think I would prefer that not to happen. I don't think it will happen because I'm also an optimist and think that the majority of people will take up vaccination. And I think when you start enforcing it, you fire emotions and people get totally distracted. So I think my position would be only to consider that in extremis. I think it's not the way that we should undertake these problems in a democratic and open society. In other societies, maybe compulsion is used and found to be effective. But if we are to keep with our values, we should try and keep open and give people the choice, and only in extremis consider the sorts of restraints that you were outlining, Sarah.
Can I have some? Adam, go for it.
Well, just to add that, in a way, a very meaningless thing to give someone a passport related to vaccination. We all make different sized responses. Some people who are vaccinated, the vaccine doesn't work. Vaccine immunity doesn't last forever. It would, if anything, give a false sense of reassurance to the individual when, as we've been discussing, vaccination is something we do as a population for everybody's benefit. So I think it would be an actively misleading way to go.
But wouldn't it have the advantage of starting to get parts of society working again? Thangam, one can imagine a huge pressure for it from some people.
Yes, I mean, what I've noticed in what's coming into my inbox is a real mixture of people who are, as I mentioned before, this thing about the motivator of fear, which has existed this year, people who are frightened of getting the disease and desperately want the vaccine, other people who are frightened of the vaccine, and then making these two incompatible groups into a conflict. I think I agree with others that would not be productive, although my instinct right at the beginning was it should be compulsory. I can see all the reasons why that wouldn't necessarily work. But I think in the same way as how we've made wearing a seatbelt in a car and not drunk driving socially unacceptable, a matter of social acceptability, I think we can do something similar. And I think I would say that because I'm a politician rather than a scientist. But I think making a vaccine the socially acceptable thing to do, making it the done thing, the socially desirable thing to do, I think that's going to be probably the politician's contribution to this. We're not going to be trusted if we start talking about the science.
But isn't there going to be, sure enough, we might get to that point, but in the initial stages, won't there be pressure for passports? Adam, I know you want to speak. Hang on, please do go first.
I think there will be pressure for passports. I've noticed that already. But in the same way, I've also seen pressure from some parents of children at local schools, for instance, to be guaranteed that their child will be allowed to go to school even if they donate. I think there's all sorts of pressures.
You would resist them. Adam, go for it.
Well, I mean, as Marvin said, it's important to have a trusted institution. I believe that the most trusted institution in this country is the NHS. People trust it, and people love it. And the NHS is going to be delivering vaccines. We don't need to compel people to have vaccines. They have vaccines. There will be a few people who won't. But I don't think we should be imagining that there's any need to push people into this. It's something that everyone's going to want to do.
Good.
Interestingly, one of the questions that is sort of top of the billing that's coming in, which I'd been holding off asking, was whether each of the panelists intend to have the COVID-19 vaccine offered. Now, obviously, we do, I mean, it's sort of medical conditions allowing. But okay, let me frame it another way. Are any of you hesitant, would like to see a bit more research on it? Or do you just think, look, we've got a system, the MHRA, and that works in this country, I trust it? Marvin, are you or do you know of people who are hesitant? Marvin, sorry, I can see both Paul and Adam want to come in. So I'll come to you in a minute, Marvin. Paul, go for it.
My barber is suspicious. And the last time I had my hair cut, which was a few weeks ago now, we had a very long discussion about this. And he was suspicious for not bad reasons. I mean, he was suspicious because it's new and it's not been around very long, and he wanted to be reassured. I hoped I reassured him. But really, we have very good safety measures in this country. It will be, if you look at the risk and balance, as we were hearing earlier, it's absolutely the right thing to do.
Adam.
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's also self-evident that the information we have so far, which is on several tens of thousands of people over a period of a few weeks, maybe 2 or 3 months, is a large database. And it's about the same size database as we normally have when we introduce a new vaccine. But within a few months, that's going to have noughts on the end of it. We're going to have hundreds of thousands and then millions of people who will receive this vaccine for an ever-increasing period of time. So the confidence with which we will be able to say that the vaccine works and that the vaccine is safe and there are not rare and unexpected late onset side effects will grow and grow. So people who are understandably hesitant now will have more and more evidence upon which to build their confidence. So it'll become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that this will go forward, unless, of course, there's an unexpected problem. But that doesn't usually happen, and so far it's looking really good.
Marvin, did you want to add something?
Yeah, as long as I don't get mistweeted now. I mean, I think we should have questions. Otherwise, you wouldn't need trust, right? Any scientist going into this area will go in with questions. They'll be looking for the issues. So I'm never. There aren't many issues in which I say, yeah, absolutely 100%. But my trust is in the institutions that they are doing the tests. They have, tested this for safety, and that they will go on reviewing and testing this vaccine as well for any potentially unintended consequences.
But because in a way, we obviously talk about the anti-vax and the hesitancy, but actually the arrival of the vaccine has been greeted with such excitement and enthusiasm that in a way, perhaps the surprising thing is because, particularly given that everyone's saying there will be more research to come, that there has been relatively little questioning of it. I mean, there was a question that came in saying, do you think the government have wrongly pinned hopes on these vaccines? How reliable can the data collected be? Who wants to, Adam?
Well, I think in terms of, the big discovery this month was that you can prevent COVID with a vaccine. Until the beginning of November, we had no idea. There had never been a successful coronavirus vaccine. We knew we could induce antibodies in people, but we didn't know that we could stop them getting sick. And now we do. And we really do know that. And actually, the effectiveness, the proportion of cases in these studies took us all by surprise. We were hoping for a vaccine that might be, 50, 60% efficacious, 90 plus cases. And in the third case, 70, which is very, very good. So I think we can be that these vaccines are going to do something. And we can be increasingly confident in their safety as time goes forward. We can be confident enough already to use them, and that confidence will just grow.
Okay, lots of questions on vaccines, as I say. I'm going to move on from it in just a few minutes, but I do want to ask some of these. Where is it? We have no idea for how long the vaccines confer protection or whether it prevents patients from transmitting the disease. So how can a vaccine program be seen to be a way out of the pandemic? Which is that same question in a way about talking about it as the solution. Is it the solution? Who wants to respond to that? Paul.
Well, I'm not the vaccine expert. I mean, you should move to Adam, but it is for sure part of the solution. We don't know that all the information we do need to know. That will be gradually emerging over the coming months. I think that the clamour for an exit strategy is a bit unfair on our politicians, in fact, because without that information in place, it's very difficult to have a clear information strategy. But what is clear, as I think Adam was emphasising, is we will gain knowledge over the coming months, which will deal with all of these issues, and we will know how long the immunity lasts. We will know whether it affects transmission to another person, and then we'll be able to answer these questions. And then with that information, the politicians can come up with a more sensible exit strategy.
Okay, another very popular question, which Thang, it's similar territory, Thang, if you wanted to attack on what you want to say. But it's this idea. Everyone, of course, wants to know, when do we get back to or return to some form of normalcy? Now that we have several vaccines on the way, when do the panel predict we'll have a normal life again? It is a popular idea. Thang, and when are you banking on doing more normal things?
I'm not putting a date on it. I've sort of given up the idea of putting a fixed date on anything. I think all of our notions of time this year have been somewhat altered. But I do know, and I think it builds to Adam's argument, I do know that people want to get back to a way of life when they can see their loved ones, when they can hug, when they can go to work. I mean, some of the businesses in my constituency have been absolutely decimated this year from the very necessary health precautions. So I actually think that people, when they see that even a vaccine, even if we don't yet know how long the efficacy will last for, that it's going to help us to get back to some form of normal life. I'm hoping that, like the chief scientific, the guy that was on the World at One when the first vaccine tests were announced, who did a bit of a Harry Met Sally with his yes. I'm kind of hoping that it will be spring, but I'm not banking on it being spring, but I'd really like it to be this time next year.
Marvin, when are you hoping for it?
I wouldn't put a date on. I don't know. What I have been just sharing with the city is that we shouldn't expect this vaccine to descend upon us like an impregnable shield. We're going to have to do lots of things at the same time. We're going to have to continue to follow the public health guidance. And dare I say also, this is not just a pandemic that exists without a field of social inequalities. We know that this has hit different communities differently. And I hope what we do take from this is that we have to look at issues of housing, pre-existing conditions, inequalities, all those wider social determinants of health that have made some people more vulnerable than others, and by extension, undermine the resilience of our population to be able to contend with this virus. There are deeper issues at play here than just the vaccine and the pandemic itself. In fact, there's a very interesting article in The Lancet just a little while ago called The Syndemic, describing the interaction between the communicable disease and non-communicable health conditions that already existed. We need to take our mind to the social conditions as well.
Few minutes. So, Lucy, can I have a thought from you on that?
Well, obviously we don't know the timetable. What I'm looking forward to is that over the spring, I think there'll be a gradual process that gradually we should be able to start easing things. And so I think we'll see that we're making progress, even if we can't suddenly all go back to everything we wanted to do, that we should start seeing progress in the right direction. And that will be really fantastic.
You want a final word? Yes, Adam, I'll come to you in a minute. Stephan first.
Yeah, I think the optimism is wonderful. I think we should look forward to the vaccine coming out of the pandemic. But now is not the time to relax your social distancing and your other public health measures. In fact, now it would be really, really dangerous to go out and say, hey, we're so close to the end of it, I'll be fine. You don't want to be the last soldier in this war. So that is one thing I just want to make very clear. Be careful.
Right. Adam, I can see you wanting to come in, and I'll come to you, Paul, after that. Adam, I do want you as well to focus on a question that's come in, which I'm sorry to bring in this late in the day, but it might, and I don't want to spoil the party about the, returning to normal. But the question is, how much threat is posed by COVID-19's ability to genetically mutate and to subsequently adapt to its immediate environment? Are we going to have another one hot on the heels?
Yeah, an interesting question. I mean, it is already mutating to an extent. Somehow that hasn't led to it becoming immunologically different to the point that the vaccines need to be redesigned. But it is the kind of virus that has the potential to do that. And then the vaccines would need to be redesigned, as indeed we do every year with flu vaccines. So that needs to be very closely monitored. But I think we have solutions to that problem if it happens. And of course, as more and more people get immune from having the infection and now from having vaccines, the selection pressure on the virus to change will increase. And so the likelihood of that happening will increase too. But the other point I wanted to make about normal is that while I certainly am not proposing that we all spend the rest of our lives wearing masks and never touching each other, I think it's probably worth mentioning that we've seen a disappearance of a number of other infectious diseases in the context of the last year. We were doing a big study on chickenpox in Bristol and a number of other cities around the country, and the studies come to an end because there's just no chickenpox. We're not seeing meningitis cases this year, and usually at this time of year in paediatrics.
This is the problem of listening to the scientists.
Sorry?
I said,
sorry?
I was just a joke. I said, this is the trouble of listening to the scientists, but it was just a joke.
Well, just to finish the point, we normally have an epidemic of respiratory syncytial virus that hospitalizes large numbers of infants at this time of year. We've not seen a single case. So it may be that we can learn a little bit from the way we've been behaving during the current year and actually reduce some of the other infections that we are normally troubled by.
Final word, Sir Paul Nurse.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say vaccines are incredibly important, but also other factors are important too. Vaccination can be well complemented by highly effective testing. We've been testing here in the Francis Crick Institute, you can see it behind me, for 6 months. We've had 1,200 scientists working here all that time, and we have had no transmission of the virus within the Institute because we test regularly all the time. That should have been applied to the vulnerable in hospitals and care homes as soon as possible, and I'm afraid it was not. And that caused a lot of problems at the beginning. So there are other things that can help as well. Vaccines really matter, but testing can play a contribution as well.
The question we were answering though, when are you expecting your life to go back to a form of normal, Paul?
Well, what I was trying to stress is that actually it's been more normal here than nearly anywhere else. I've been at work every day this year, or nearly every day this year, because we have such a secure testing environment. If you're asking me... Sorry?
I said, I'm sure you do things outside your work. What happens when you go home? When are you expecting normal there?
Well, you get infected on the tube, of course. I mean, that's what happens when you go home. But and what infections we've had have been like that. I only wanted to mention there's other things. If you're asking me when I think it'll be back to normal, I would say more likely to be around summer and autumn. But things will gradually get better from the winter onwards. That would be my guess. It's a guess, though.
Thank you so much. I am going to hand over now to Jeremy, and from my part, thank you all very much, and well done with dealing with the comms. But Jeremy, now back to you.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic, and I trust you all found that as thought-provoking as I did. In my lifetime, the life sciences have never been more relevant to us, and I think it was encapsulated in that conversation. Sarah, thank you so much for your expert manoeuvring around the panel this evening. Really enjoyed working with you on this project. I'd also like to thank all of our distinguished panelists for their role in such a brilliant discussion going off in many different directions. I'd also like to thank Emma Henry, Kathleen Sedgley and Rich Elliott for their hard work and support in creating today's event. And most importantly to you, our audience, for your participation and providing the fascinating questions that you sent in before and during the event. I do hope the discussion managed to capture the essence of the majority of them. I think Sarah, you did a fantastic job. I'm only sorry we couldn't have held the event in person because we would have filled the wonderful, great hall of the university with the evening's audience. But I do know using this newfangled technology, we've been able to reach an audience around the globe. And congratulations to Sarah for coping with that slight break in comms. So finally, please can I encourage you to fill in the feedback survey and look out for other events at bristol.ac.uk/events. And it just remains for me to say thank you, good evening to you, and I'll leave you with the film to watch again. Thank you.
COVID-19. Scientists here at Bristol University are some of the few who are growing the human coronavirus involved in this outbreak.
You really need to start to dissect the virus on many different levels, dissect our immune response. So the work we're doing here, or some of the work we're doing here, is going to be to start to underpin that.
Colleagues in the School of Chemistry have identified some antiviral agents that may be effective against COVID.
The main aim of our research is to identify drugs that bind to and therefore block the function of proteins that are encoded by viral genes.
And we have lots of really amazing researchers here at Bristol looking at the virus.
With collaborations with the University of Bristol's Uncover group, as well as Public Health England, we can look at immunity following the virus, as well as secondary infections and respiratory compromise when people are recovering.
It's one of the biggest questions we face right now. How long does COVID-19 stay infectious in the air?
One of the big benefits of being in Bristol is that we have an expert team of virologists who've worked with coronaviruses for many years.
And we are also collaborating with researchers at Oxford University who have given us access to experimental data measuring the coronavirus proteins.
We discovered a new feature of SARS-CoV-2 which was entirely unexpected. It links physiology, the disease, and the virus itself.
And the mutations on the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein are the ones responsible for this higher infectivity of the virus.
Everybody is talking about vaccines to defeat the COVID-19 crisis, and we all are hopeful that vaccines will be the solution. So we need to try everything to get the upper hand.